and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Well, after a long time, the spotlight is back on oil prices. The latest inflation numbers, as measured by the Wholesale Price Index WPI for January 2017, show that it is a sharp rise in the index for fuel and power that's responsible for the much higher WPI. Even as the index for primary articles declined by 0.2% and for manufactured products rose only very modestly, inflation in the fuel and power basket more than doubled to 18.14%, up from just 8.65% the previous month. Given that we are critically dependent on imports for close to 80% of our oil requirements, an increase in the price of oil is bad news for three reasons. It adds to inflationary pressures in the economy, it pushes up our import bill, endangering our current account balance at a time when exports are already not doing well, and risks a return to the old subsidy raj as government comes under increasing pressure to keep prices under check. So how worried should we be about the oil sector and prices going forward? We're going to try and take a look into that issue with two experts, Narendra Taneja, co-chairman of the Hydrocarbons Committee, FICCI, and Saurabh Chandra, former Petroleum Secretary. Welcome to the show, Mr. Taneja, Mr. Chandra. Let me start by asking both of you in turn, what is your prognosis for the oil sector and why? We'll go into the details a little later in the program, but for now, could you just sum it up in a few sentences? Let me start with you, Mr. Chandra. The talk seems to have changed now from peak oil to peak demand. After all, oil is nowhere near as dominant as it was in the 70s, for instance. At the time of the oil embargo in 1973, oil accounted for 46% of global energy supply. But by 2014, the share had fallen to 31% and is likely to fall further as climate change concerns come to the forefront. So where do you see it settle, Mr. Chandra?
The oil demand is expected to go up. It's about 93 million barrels per day, and people expect it to go up to about 98, 99 by 2020-21. The rate of growth has slowed down, but in absolute terms, it will continue to rise. Now, the issue is if there is a cutback in production, a deliberate cutback, the oil prices may rise unexpectedly. Otherwise, I would expect it to be between $55 and $60, although it's very difficult to predict oil prices. At the beginning of January 2016, they were about 26, 27. By the end of the year, they were 54. But my guess is during the course of this year, it should be between 55 and 60. And if the president of the US brings back its oil industry, some of the environmental concerns are not taken so seriously as they were earlier, perhaps the oil production in the US would also increase.
Mr. Taneja, do you agree with that assessment? Is oil really facing its Model T moment, as the London Economist magazine put it? The danger, it says, is not of an imminent collapse in demand, but the start of a shift in the investment strategies away from finding new sources of oil to finding alternatives. The immediate catalyst seems to be the global response to climate change and the Paris Agreement on climate change. Or do you think that now with US President Trump in charge, climate change is no longer a consideration? After all, he's a man who dismissed climate change as a big hoax. Mr. Taneja?
Whatever President Trump may say, the fact is not hoax. It's a concern for everybody. But I think the important issue is what we are discussing here is the transition. Is the transition from fossil fuels to renewables is going to be overnight? Answer is no. Is it going to take 10 years? No. Depending on the economy where you are. If you are Sweden, Switzerland and Norway, transition is going to be faster. But if you are an emerging economy like India, where you still have a large percentage of people living below energy poverty line, and the same goes for Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, Middle East, and a number of other countries. So transition is going to take time, from 10 years for some countries to maybe 70 years for other economy. For India, my own guess is this transition is going to take about 40 to 60 years. So now the question is, when you look at the global energy mix, the role of oil will continue to be almost central, at least for another 20-25 years. After that, the role of natural gas is going to grow. That is again hydrocarbon of the same family. So oil and gas put together, role of oil and gas and global energy and mix is going to be very significant for very long time to come, about 40 years. But at the same time, renewables will grow and they will start occupying bigger space. My own assessment is by 2050, renewables and nuclear are going to play a very big role, more renewables, but at the same time, natural gas will be there, oil will also be important, though the role of coal will become almost very insignificant. That's the scenario. Now, coming to your another second question, prices. Prices in oil, basically two factors are always important, demand and supply, yes. But demand and supply is very often impacted by what, for instance, the anxieties are in terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics. Geopolitics still plays a big role. Middle East is a major supplier of oil. Russia is a major supplier of oil. Latin America is a major supplier of oil. Unfortunately, all these three regions I talked about are, when it comes to geopolitics, are very, very volatile. Now the question is, practically the whole world gets its supply of crude oil from there. In America, President Trump is basically saying, I'm going to reopen areas which were otherwise closed for oil and gas and exploration, which means that, there will be more supply of oil, at least to the United States and maybe neighboring economy. At OPEC and non-OPEC, Russia have joined hands to push the prices up. So they are going to push the prices up, and America is going to make sure the prices actually do not go up beyond a point. If geopolitics remain under control, there are no big anxiety, there are no triggers, there are no major attacks on Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq on the oil installation. My assessment is oil prices will remain in the region of about $50 to $60, that band, for at least 2017. And after that, we will have to see. But if there is no geopolitical trigger, I think they are going to remain again more or less in the same region. In about 10 years from now, they will start actually coming down. And by that time, the role of renewable will be more. But let's not forget, let's not get carried away by television programs, media coverage, and these kind of, statements by some of the people. I call them green ayatollahs, renewable ayatollahs. We must respect them. But at the same time, transition is not going to be as fast as they wish or they want. So I think oil will remain important. Prices will remain, for instance, dependent on the geopolitical factor, geoeconomical factor. And as far as India is concerned, if prices go beyond $60 per barrel, we have got reasons to worry. But my own kind of assessment is at least 2017, to the extent I can see on the horizon, I think we don't need to worry. But what is important, we need to invest more on renewables, and we need to modernize our oil and gas sector. Right now, India's oil and gas sector is not modernized, rather antiqued. It's run in a very Soviet-style manner. So we must reform it, change it, modernize it, because oil importance is not going to go away for India for a long time. For natural gas is not going to go away for not 30, 40 years. So we must invest in both oil and gas and at the same time in renewables.
We'll come to the geopolitics of oil a little later in the program, but if I can address the issue of the green ayatollahs, as Mr. Taneja put it, I'd like to get you in on that, Mr. Chandra. Is climate change really off the radar? Will demand for oil continue to surge? Or as the International Energy Agency predicts, is surging demand for oil a thing of the past? The agency expects oil demand would peak in 2020 at 93 million barrels per day, just above current levels. Would you agree with that assessment?
There are different estimates, but my guess is that it will rise to about 100 million barrels per day. Now, climate change concerns would be different for different countries. For India, we would still have to look at increasing oil consumption. Petrol and diesel consumption would go up as we move ahead. The US, which consumes about a quarter of the world's oil, they may cut back. They should actually cut back, but they try to maintain it at the same level. The American way of life will not be sustained if it's cut back. Therefore, I do not see any chances of the oil consumption going below 100 million barrels per day, which it will perhaps reach in the next 4 to 5 years. Almost half of that would be consumed by the emerging economies, and in particular India. India has to be concerned. It's one of the factors, perhaps not the only factor, which is making the air toxic, which is affecting all of us today. There are other factors that the source study of IIT Kanpur has shown, but it will remain a concern. And going ahead, we will have to rely more and more on natural gas. Future is for tight oil as Mr. Taneja has said, this is all a technology play now. Our public sector companies which have to lead exploration, development and production efforts in the upstream sector have to acquire the latest cutting edge technology in all segments of the business.
Mr. Taneja, Mr. Chandra spoke about how oil is so critically important for India and how the emerging markets will consume almost 50% of the total demand. But what is the comfort range as far as India is concerned? And is there a trade-off between price and availability? Because even though the two are closely linked, the fact is that geopolitics, as both of you mentioned, is also a big factor in the oil market. So what is the comfort range for us?
Well, good question. You see, it depends on the size of the economy. In 20 years from now, we are hopefully going to be roughly $12 trillion economy, even if we can maintain 8% growth rate. So 12 trillion, which means, you see, at the same time, we will need more oil to get there. We will need more natural gas to get there. I mean, look at the pace of construction of roads we are doing. If we are building more roads across the country and we are connecting practically every part of the country to the other part of the country, roads are going to be used by whom? By motor vehicles, and you need petrol for that, you need diesel for that. Electric mobility will be there, but it's going to take a long time, very, very long time. See, and even to generate electricity, we need fuel, and we need more oil, maybe we need more natural gas in time to come, if not coal. So we come back to the same thing. As far as India is concerned, look at the reality today. If you do a reality check, who is driving the oil market today in terms of demand? India. It used to be China. Last 20 years was China. Today is India. And now, coming 10 years, India is going to be in the cockpit as far as the oil demand is concerned and oil prices are concerned. Therefore, producers are now looking at India, whether Venezuela, Iran, or Nigeria, or Saudi Arabia, or Russia, they are all looking at India. That's why Russians recently bought into SR Oil. Why did they buy? To secure demand of their oil. So other countries are going to do the same. You will soon see Saudis and others knocking at India's door to buy equity in India's refinery because they want to secure demand for their oil, because they know India is a market when it comes to oil. So I think this will continue. In terms of what is the comfortable of prices, I think today when you look at it, even if $60 per barrel is a price India is comfortable with. Gradually, if 20 years from now prices go, let's say $100 per barrel, but that would be equal to almost $70 per barrel. Again, that Indian economy would be able to absorb. And let's not forget one thing, that we are doing very well in terms of renewables. We have among the most ambitious plans, and our oil and gas companies are also diversifying into renewables, including solar. So I think the picture is going to change. But the question is important to understand, not to get carried away by the kind of reports which are appearing in Western media in particular, because in our country, transition is going to be slow. We have 70% of our population living below hydrocarbon poverty line, and they also are now getting access to smartphone. They're going to demand more oil, more natural gas, and so on and so forth. So the result is, for us, demand for oil and natural gas is going to grow. And my own assessment is, if we make sure that Middle East does not go up and kind of up in flames, then I think oil prices will remain in that region. But as I said, when it comes to oil, it's extremely, extremely sensitive to geopolitics. Russia is facing some kind of turmoil. The entire Middle East is going through turmoil. Venezuela is in turmoil. Nigeria is not the most stable country in the world. Angola, not the most stable country in the world. With President Trump in Russia, when it comes to President Trump in the United States, America has also joined the same club in the sense that very volatile when it comes to oil policy, when it comes to... So now the question is, when it comes to the oil map of the world, it's all volatile. So it's very difficult to predict.
Very difficult to predict, but we'll come back to the geopolitics, but after a little break. It's good to know that India is in the cockpit somewhere, even if it is in the case of oil demand. But it's time for us now to slip into a very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with Mr. Chandra and Mr. Taneja on the future of oil prices in the oil sector, given our critical dependence, particularly on oil imports. Mr. Chandra, before the break, Mr. Taneja was expanding on how vulnerable we are to the geopolitics of global oil market. So how vulnerable are we really? Or can we count on some friends who will be there for us at all times? Or is that too naive a view? Because when it comes to strategic concerns, there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. So can India really afford to ignore the geopolitics of it all?
I personally believe that we need to cut down our import dependence. Energy security comes when you produce in your backyard. We need to step up the production in this country. The oil and gas production, on the other hand, has been falling. This needs to be arrested and increased. Exploration needs to get far more attention. Today, about 50% of the sedimentary basin is not yet covered by a rudimentary 2D survey. There is a scheme which is being implemented, which needs to be implemented in a time-bound fashion to ensure that the entire sedimentary basin of about 1.5 million square kilometers is covered within the next 3 years. Thereafter, the exploration, a lot more money has to be put into it. The model for exploration has been changed. The production sharing contracts which were there for almost 15 years have not yielded any significant quantities of oil and gas. The response to the discovered small fields policy was encouraging. The test would be when HELP, the hydrocarbon exploration licensing policy, is up on the blocks, whether we can get any of the 6 biggies to come in and participate in these auctions, if necessary, with the national oil companies, plus what the national oil companies are doing, especially in places like Bombay High. They may think of bringing in big technology players to arrest the decline there, to bring in IOR, EOR, so that even if necessary, by giving a small portion of the PI, which would mean some money flowing into the government's exchequer also.
Let me just ask Mr. Taneja that question. Mr. Taneja, can we really reduce our import dependence? Because the fact is that on the price front, most observers agree that even if oil is going to remain in this range of $50 to $60 a barrel, prices today are double what they were a year ago. And the government clearly is not very confident that we will be able to increase our own domestic production, because in the last budget, the FM announced government's decision to beef up our strategic reserves. So is the fear warranted? And do strategic reserves really make a difference for a big importer like India? At best, they can buy you a little bit of time. So what is the logic of strategic reserves?
Good question. First of all, can we really reduce our dependence on imports? No, we can't, unfortunately. We are not as blessed, for instance, as some people think in terms of oil and gas, potential. Now, most of oil and gas is in deep water, where the cost of production is very high. If we are producing at a cost which we ourselves can't afford, then what do we do with that oil? Maybe it's cheaper to import from Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other places. So unfortunately, many of our new finds may turn out to be unviable in terms of prices, and cheap imports would be better. So my own assessment is our dependence on import is going to touch 90% in near future. It's probably sooner than what we think. And basic economics would be simple in the sense wherever we are producing, we continue to produce like Bombay High and other places. But I think when it comes to deep water and ultra deep water, this is going to be a huge challenge in terms of viability. Now, question of reserves. These reserves, I think the way they are constructed now, the way they are putting it together is, I think, is interesting in the sense where you are letting foreign companies come and use the reserves, so that we are not really investing our own money, and they can use that so that in order to export to Korea, Japan, and other places from now. But at the same time, in case of an emergency or war, we would have the first right to use them. I think it's a good idea, but at the same time, I think what is important is that, we acquire oil and gas assets overseas. That is probably a better idea, and use that money for investment in future sources of energy, including renewables and so forth. I think our thinking is fine, but we need to be a little more innovative. We've got to think more out of the box. But what is important is, point I want to underline is, in order to get there, in order to achieve that, we need absolutely world-class state-owned oil and gas companies. Question is, are our companies absolutely world-class? Are they truly world-class? Have we really helped them to become world-class? Have we given them the kind of autonomy they need in order to become world-class? Answer to all these questions is no, no, no. Now the question is, you need these platforms, you need these companies to deliver on all these kind of requirements of the nation in terms of energy security. And on that front, we have not really done very much.
In fact, I think that's one issue on which both you and Mr. Chandra see completely eye to eye. But Mr. Chandra, if I can ask you that since June 2014, when international oil prices started declining, India actually increased the excise duty on oil products as many as 9 times. Do you see the government being willing to cut back on its excise duty as prices rise? Or will revenue considerations always dominate because the government doesn't have too much of revenue to start with?
Well, one of the ways to handle uncertainty was to increase excise duties. So if the need arises and oil prices shoot beyond all limits, as they did in 2012-14 period, some relief can be given to the consumer by reducing excise duties. My personal guess is that till $70 odd, the government wouldn't be too worried. Every $10 increase in crude oil prices means an increase of 4 to 5 rupees a liter in petrol and diesel. Maybe the consumer can be made to bear it for petrol going up to 80 odd rupees, but thereafter the concerns would come and excise duty cuts may have to be brought into the picture, particularly on petrol and to some extent on diesel.
Especially because governments and democracies also have to win elections. So there's a limit to how much they can really afford to raise prices. But Mr. Taneja, both you and Mr. Chandra spoke about the need to bring better technology, having world-class companies. And the government in this budget also announced plans to create a single integrated public sector oil behemoth. Will this really help reduce our vulnerability in the oil sector? Are mergers necessarily the best? Look at what happened to Air India and Indian Airlines. So is this the answer?
Well, I think very good question. I think if the government is talking about reducing number of oil and gas, enterprises, government-owned enterprise from 13 to maybe more, kind of manageable 5 and 6, I support that idea. If you have to, for instance, you are thinking of merging Oil India Limited and ONGC Videsh and Mangalore Refinery and a couple of other such entities, which are already kind of part of the big ONGC group, but Oil India is out of it. Merging all the upstream companies into one, I think that's a smart idea because that will provide ONGC group as a whole muscles and strength in order to go and compete with the Chinese of the world and the Malaysians of the world in terms of acquiring oil and gas assets. But if you are thinking of merging all into one, means ONGC, Indian Oil, HPCL, BPCL. HPCL used to be, as we all know, SO. BPCL used to be Shell with a very distinct and DNA, very distinct and DNA. Okay. Indian Oil is a very distinct DNA. Sure. ONGC is a very, very different culture, completely different culture. It's almost like as if it belongs to some other planet. So I think unless you see some great reason for that, I personally think it's not a very smart idea, but reducing the number would not be a bad idea. But bringing all into under one umbrella, I don't really think it's a very smart idea.
Well, you're so entirely right. Any merger must keep the DNA of the merged entities in mind. But I'm afraid we've completely run out of time, so I'll have to end this discussion now. Clearly, as far as the oil sector is concerned, nothing can be taken for granted. And yet, since the price of oil and its sheer availability is so critical to us in India, we have no alternative but to keep a close watch on what is happening in the global oil markets and keep ourselves in readiness for any eventuality. Thank you so much, Mr. Chandra, as well as Mr. Taneja, for joining me in this discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. In the meanwhile, in case there is any other topic that you'd like to see discussed threadbare in Macros with Mythili, do mail us at the mail address that you see at the bottom of your screen. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.